This is the sixth and final seminar in our series for this autumn. The series is called Beyond Survival. The little background to that is that, like everybody else, early this year into the summer, my work was very badly affected by the coronavirus crisis. My clients, who are mainly cultural organizations, were suffering very badly. Most of them had to close their door. This suffered financial consequences. They weren't able to perform or put on new exhibitions, whatever their job is. And I wondered what would they do? And then I wondered how I could help. And in the short term, the answer was I couldn't help at all, because my work is essentially about helping people develop new business strategies, new income streams, new fundraising programs, and so on. Short term, that doesn't really help. So the Beyond Survival seminar series is partly a personal reaction, asking myself and asking the speakers who have joined us for this year, what would happen beyond the coronavirus crisis? We know that now the vaccines are available, but that's going to take a long time for the vaccine program to roll out across the whole population and for things to get back to anything like they were in 2019. In 2 years' time, 2020, 2021, the world will change. What will it look like? Where do we go beyond survival? And this includes questions which were already relevant before the crisis, like digitization, digital business models, like diversity and inclusion. Is now the time really to grapple these problems that have perhaps been put on the back burner. What about new business models? Because it's not clear that the way culture has operated in business terms, in terms of funding, it's not clear that will go back to how it was. So beyond survival, we're thinking longer term here, not survival in the current situation. This series has been successful in my eyes. We've had speakers from New York, from Berlin, from London, now from the West Midlands, even more glamorous than London, and of course several from the Netherlands. Very high quality debates. Those seminars are also available to look at on video form on YouTube. Today's seminar, originally planned for a couple of weeks ago, has been postponed because of availability of speakers, and it concerns local government. Local government, most parts of the world, certainly in Western Europe and the United States, plays an important role in supporting culture, not just with money, although of course that's very important, but also in terms of providing a framework for their organizations, policy guidelines, practical support in other ways, helping making partnerships. So today's seminar is entitled Local Government, the Key Link in the Cultural Chain. They are, it is, and we've invited speakers from 2 countries, well, maybe 3, if you think of Rotterdam and Amsterdam as different countries somehow. Anyway, Araf Ahmadli from Amsterdam, he will introduce himself in a second. Now, Araf works directly for the city council, so he's inside the beast, let's put it that way. Rento Zoutman, on the other hand, works slightly to one side of the city council. The Arts Council gives advice, which certainly has a great influence on the decisions of the city council, but Araf does not have a big budget of his own to play with. Erica Love runs the West Midlands Culture Central, which is intended to form partnerships of cultural organizations across a whole region, a very big region in the United Kingdom, and creating partnerships which also cover local government organizations and sometimes other kinds of organizations as well. Each of them is now going to introduce themselves, and then we'll start addressing some of the key questions which seem to me important in the future role of local government. Araf, can I ask you to start, please? Tell us who you are, what you do, and a little about your background.
Hi, everybody. My name is Araf. I'm a Senior Policy Advisor for Arts and Culture at the City of Amsterdam. At the moment, I am mainly focusing on the COVID-19 crisis and recovery strategy ever since March. Before, and even still during COVID, I'm also focusing within City Hall on international cultural affairs, on all of our relationships with the national government. I've set up a program for the region of Amsterdam called the Metropolitan Area of Amsterdam, a whole cultural program. I am also leading an initiative on creating a night vision for the city of Amsterdam. So a policy strategy on nightlife. And we've been working on a clear strategy on digitization and culture for the last few months. And somehow all of these topics were all of a sudden very relevant when COVID struck. And I've been working at the City of Amsterdam since 8 years. 3 years before that, I was a trainee at the Ministry of Culture, and I was stationed in London, and that's where I met one person called David Dixon. So we actually go way back, David. And I'm very happy here to be here today and to share more of my insights and experience so far of managing the COVID crisis from a local government's point of view when it comes to culture, and at the same time exploring ways in which we now are looking ahead towards the future.
And I particularly like the fact you can also bring in your experience from working in the United Kingdom, and as I said, a little in New York, because it means you can make those comparisons. Really interesting. Erica, I'm going to turn to you now, and you'll have to do a little more work, particularly explaining what is the West Midlands. You have a video, I think. Would you like me to play that now, or do you want to say a few words first?
I'll say a few words and then we can play the video if that works. I've actually got a very quick presentation if that's okay, so it might be easier for people to see. So, hi everyone, I'm Erica Love. I am Director of Culture Central, which was a Birmingham-based organisation. If you know the UK, we are the second biggest city other than London, I would say. And in March, when COVID hit, we set up the West Midlands Culture Response Unit. This was really a sector-led, so that's the difference that we sit here. We're very much a sector-led, action-orientated unit that's about the visibility, viability and recovery of the cultural sector in the West Midlands. Just to give you a bit of a context of how it works within the UK and the local government context as well. So the way that our things are mostly funded is we have Arts Council England, which sounds very similar to Arts Council, but obviously this is a non-governmental body. It's arm's length from government, but it does channel arts funding through them. And obviously it's also with National Lottery as well. So there is a number of regularly funded organisations and also then project funding for arts and culture. We have our local governments, which is complex as well. So we have regional governments, which might cover the West Midlands Combined Authority. Then you have sort of the Greater London Authority or Greater Manchester. So you have the larger kind of mayoral regional bodies, but then you also have your local ones that sit within that. So your cities, towns and borough councils as well. So there are layers of local government, as I'm sure there are in lots of places. And then we also have other strategic investment bodies. So they might be interested in place, for example, local enterprise partnerships, which are around business and economics of a city or a town or a place. This is the West Midlands, just as a little snapshot. So as you can see, we're a very broad area. So if you're London's obviously red on the map, so you can see kind of geography wise, but we're made up of really kind of high density cities like Birmingham, and then you've got the Black Country. Then you've got more rural areas like Shropshire and Herefordshire, and then you've kind of got, again, the leafier places in Warwickshire, all with various different mix of rural towns and cities, and who often are not known to work together particularly well to start off with. We've got an interesting profile in terms of economy, but it has been growing quite rapidly, certainly within the creative industries across the West Midlands in the years prior to COVID, about the 5 years. This regional profile is from 2012, which was the most recent that I could find. Just to give you a sense, so the names are there, but actually what our scope is around a collective voice for advocacy and public messaging for the sector. We don't have funds to distribute and we don't produce artistic work particularly, and our role is very much about coordination and facilitation to bring around collaboration. This is how we set it up. So Culture Central are kind of in the middle, and obviously we have all of our cultural sector. So we have our regularly funded organisations and museums. We also do try and connect with the commercial sector, although that's a little bit more challenging. We also connect with some of the very big events that we've got coming up in our region. So we have a UK City of Culture, which is different than the European one, but we run that every 4 years. And this year it's in Coventry, which is in our region. And in 2022, we have the Commonwealth Games hosted in Birmingham and the wider region. So we connect with those as well. Obviously, huge amounts of festivals. What's interesting is we also try and work again cross-sector. So we work with business and bids. Sorry for the acronym there. They are business improvement districts. So they are kind of like Alongside taxes that get taken for rent, they also get taken from businesses to improve their towns and high streets, to promote their towns and high streets. And that is collected from businesses in those specific places. We work with the Chamber of Commerce, which is again a business support organisation. We work with public health, the nighttime industries and other creative industries. So to be clear, we set ourselves differently. We are definitely arts and culture and heritage. And then you have another strand, which is creative industries, which is kind of dealt by another sector body. But what we also do is work very, very closely with Arts Council, the West Midlands Combined Authority, just moving myself on the screen, local authorities. There's all sorts of city boards, and we work with the DCMS and also trade unions. So the idea is that they all kind of feed into the conversations that we have. These are just the principles that we work on, which is inclusivity, transparency, authenticity, and collaboration. And our strands are around strategy. So that is that research and lobbying. And because we're sector-led, we can sit outside, I think, some of those formal structures of government, so we can talk to them about what we need and they can advocate on our behalf. And looking at funding investment and recovery planning. We do some great stuff, which we'll show you the video of in a second. So we try and communicate with the sector and around the sector about everything that's happening as much as possible, and a central access point for people to speak to the sector, and also a region-wide audiences campaign. We also do training, mentoring, and sector-specific seminars. Well, that's it. And then, David, I don't know if you're happy to share the video, which is something that we did at the very beginning of lockdown. It's just got a really nice message I thought that was worth sharing around COVID and some positivity.
That fabled return to glory from the jaws of defeat. But perhaps our greatest comeback is yet to be seen. We're no stranger to hardship. Scarred by war, bombs, closures, conflict. We've had our denigrators and haters, but none of that has ever fazed us. We've come back before. This is the workshop of the world after all. Pioneers raised in these streets, shaping game changers, thinkers, winners, heroes hidden in plain sight, a place where great industry was brought to life. There's something very special about the beat in the heart of the country. A whole lot of love to go around in our towns. But now,
COVID-19,
this virus, our lives came to a grinding halt. Our families separated. Our icons silenced, our businesses crushed. Last orders called, our kitchens shut. Our museums, our venues, our galleries, empty without purpose. As we remember those we have lost. But even when things get tough, we will always pull each other up. And if you didn't know by now, we are the boxer that doesn't stay down. A phoenix rising from the flames, a roaring lion that could never be tamed. We will come back strong. And those things that we took for granted will be cherished. And the hundreds of thriving independent businesses that survive will flourish. And as for us, we got creative. We listened more, connected more, loved more, shared more, even from the confines of our own homes. Life sprang around us. The birds sang in long-forgotten chorus. We breathed better air. Nature reset. And when the cloud lifts, the light will flood in. We will come back strong, West Midlands. Our venues will pack again. In our restaurants or on our streets, we will feast. Our theatres and cinemas will entertain us. Our pubs will open their doors. In the stadiums of our heroes, we will roar louder than ever before. We will descend upon our markets, our arcades. We will shake hands once again. And on the walls of our cities, we will mark the days when we came out of the dark. The days when Birmingham and the West Midlands, the best Midlands, ignited a fire that burned so brightly the darkness never wanted to return. And we can look forward once more to our moments in the spotlight. You really don't know what you've got till it's gone. But our time will come again. And the comeback is on.
Thank you. That's wonderful. So now I want to know if Amsterdam and Rotterdam have something like that. Anyway, Rento.
Yo mensen, mijn naam is Gastjob
en welkom terug bij een nieuwe video.
YouTube, sorry.
Hier op Dora's beste vriend.
YouTube rolls on, so sorry about that. I'm glad it was nothing else. Okay, so now we turn to Renzo Zoutman, who I know does have a presentation for us, but not a video. So you're going to be able to follow that, Renzo. Tell us about yourself, please.
Yes, thank you, David. A very encouraging video. Thank you, Erica, for this boost in these difficult times. Well, my name is Renzo Zoutman. I'm a managing director of the Bureau of the Rotterdam Council for Arts and Culture, which is RRKC in Dutch brief. And I'm also the director of the bureau. We have a bureau with 7 people, 3 policy advisors and support staff that support the council. I worked in the cultural sector. I've worked in the cultural sector for about 30 years, a long time. Earlier at the Union of Dutch Municipalities, whereas I was a senior advisor on cultural policy, working with all municipalities in Holland for their support on culture. And I worked later as a consultant and partner at DSP Group, which is a research and advice institution in Amsterdam, in the Van Diemenstraat. Well, since 2016, I'm a director of the Rotterdam Council for Art. I work here with much pleasure. Rotterdam is a booming city. Even in COVID times, we keep up our spirits and try to do the best we can. Well, what we do, I will tell something about the council. The council has 11 members, including the chairman, Jacob van der Groot, who will be in the audience today on this webinar. So probably he can put in some questions or answers later on. And well, we come together 4 times a year, and we have committees on specific subjects like inclusivity or the renovation of the big museum of Boijmans van Beuningen in Rotterdam, on which we gave advice. And the biggest task we have is once every 4 years to give advice on the Cultuurplan, which is the 4-year subsidy division in Rotterdam, which is a parallel process to the national division of money. That's a big task because we get in a few months' time, we have to go through 122 commissions or applicants, how you call them, applications for money, and give advice on all these individual applications, but also give a total advice on how the health of the city culture in Rotterdam is. How's the situation? How do we estimate that? So for doing that, we do monitoring of cultural organizations which are in the Cultuurplan. Next Cultuurplan will have 94 cultural organizations, small, middle, large organizations. We inform the sector on with all kinds of information. So we are working with the sector in Rotterdam and also with people outside of the sector, researchers, scientists, all kinds of people we need. We mobilize the sector, sometimes a bit like what Erica, I think, does, mobilize the sector to cooperate. But we are not we are an advice institution to the government of Rotterdam. So our role is to give advice to the government, local government, and our relation with the sector is that we work together with them, or we do things separate. That also happens. Well, so what we do every day is I work with committees. We form them from people from Rotterdam and outside of Rotterdam, experts, people who have knowledge of the cultural sector, but also economics and others, and to give the best advice we can to the local government. Well, that's in short what I do every day, and with much pleasure. And yeah, I can go to the Rotterdam. I have a short PowerPoint presentation, but David has to say if this is a good time to go through that, to give you an impression of the Rotterdam situation in relation to the questions that are on the table here in this seminar. Can you go to the next page directly then?
Oh, there we go.
Yeah. Okay, to give you a short impression of how, was one of the questions is in the seminar, which instruments does the local government have to support the cultural sector? In Rotterdam, we have diverse instruments. They are on this sheet. We have a Rotterdamse culturele basis in Dutch, and which amounts to 45 million plus. In which are 8 large organizations in Rotterdam: Luxor Theatre, Theatre Rotterdam, the Schouwburg, the Doelen, Philharmonic Orchestra, etc. We have Cultuurplan organizations that are in a new Cultuurplan 2021-2024. There are in total, I think, 86. 8 are the Rotterdamse Culturele Basis, which are also in the Cultuurplan for 4 years, but have a different status. And the Cultuurplan organizations, which are larger, smaller, all kinds of organizations. There are small urban organizations in it, also the larger institutions that are already for a longer time in the Cultuurplan. Because this is, I think, the 5th time or the 6th time, I'm not sure, that the Cultuurplan is in working in this in these 4 years periods. The city of Rotterdam has project subsidies for projects on culture. They have an impulse regeling cultuur, and that's just 2-year subsidies they have. So that's a sort of that's a new regulation, and there are now some organizations in this impulse regeling, and they are the when they got through that impulse regeling, the idea is that they will be able to go through to the Cultuurplan, which is more difficult to come into. And they also have plus programma's. Plus programma's are extra programs to enhance goals like diversity or inclusivity. And in that, the local government works together with the sector. And we have 2 things I didn't mention in this sheet was that we have cultural loans. We work together with the national organization Cultuuronderneming for cultural loans to the sector. And we have crowdfunding options, also facilitated by the local government. So that's the palette of instruments you can see. And apart from that, Rotterdam has a rich tradition in private funding. We have a very large fund, Droom en Daad, but Wim Pijbers is a name that's in publicity. He makes his own projects in Rotterdam also, but also subsidizes or gives money to all kinds of large projects from local organizations. He buys buildings for cultural purposes, everything like that. Okay, next sheet, please, David. So what is new in this 2021-2024 is that the city of Rotterdam has in this period 30 million extra for culture, apart from the crisis measures that are there. So this 30 million for cultural sector for the development in these 4 years. And a large sum of this goes, 2.5 million a year goes to fair pay, a realization of fair pay, because that was a problem. And I think Rotterdam is one of the first municipalities that gives money to all the Cultuurplan organizations to come to fair pay, more than if that's possible for them. There's a large noodfonds of 11 million for sports and culture. And in the past half year, 24 organizations profited from this fund, and 22 have put in applications for new support. And there is a Denk Tank New Deal that was recently instated. It's called New Deal because there's a belief at the municipality and also at our Arts Council that you have to help in this situation artists and local entrepreneurs that have become jobless to help them to a good future. So this New Deal it should be helpful in that, but it's very short there, so I don't know yet if it will work. And in the broader picture, Rotterdam has a local government agenda to restore and renew the economy. Rotterdam has learned from 2008 when there was a large economic crisis and there were many cutbacks, and now they invest in the future. So that's a different story. There's investing in the future, and one of the things they invest in is a large cultural campus in the south of Rotterdam. So I put it on this sheet as an example of how this investment will take place. Next sheet, David. Well, very shortly about the Cultuurplan itself. 31% of these 96 Cultuurplan organizations are relatively new, smaller organizations. And one of the questions for this seminar was also how can the organization, the cultural sector, adapt? Well, these organizations are already inclusive. They have a large amount of interconnectivity with each other and sometimes with larger organizations, and they are innovative. So they change and adapt with relative ease. The problems with the larger institutions is that they are less flexible and they have more problems doing that. examples left aside because there are examples of larger institutions who do that very well. And we see growing multidisciplinarity. So we see all kinds of applicants coming into the Cultuurplan. We also have social or and combined social and cultural goals. Last sheet, David. Well, what we're working on now is in advice of our Arts Council on the future of the cultural sector. So I'm very happy to be here and to share thoughts with you because I can very well use them in our own advice. They have to cope with COVID limitations probably for a longer time. And we have to search for room and direction for the transitions that are needed on long term. And the most recent we did was have 4 thinking sessions with the cultural field in Rotterdam to ask them how their work practice is at the moment, what things are changing, and how the perspective is on the coming 2-3 years. So we picked up some knowledge from there, which we will use in the advice we will bring out in January. There is a changing role of local government. I could get back to that later in the discussion. And well, the relation with, I think, the local government has with cultural organizations is to facilitate transition in some way. But the local government also has different roles. So sometimes it's difficult to combine them. So you have to see who takes what role. That's a question we have. That's it, Dave.
Okay, Rento, thank you. So introductions made. We all now have a rough idea of your work, the work of your organizations. And we now want to return to the topic of today, which is the longer term role of local government. So beyond the COVID crisis, at the moment it's indispensable that local government support their organizations in whatever way possible. But what's going to happen in 3, 5, 10 years' time? And this is a discussion. So anybody of the 3 panelists can start by answering these questions. And for everybody else watching, in roughly half an hour, I'll be asking for questions, contributions, maybe personal examples from those people who are in the audience. And to do that, you'll simply, there's a button somewhere where you get a blue hand is raised and I can unmute you and you can speak, or else put something in the Q&A, which is down at the bottom of your screen. But for the moment, let me ask the first obvious question, and I'll ask each of the panelists in turn, really for quite a brief overview, is what you believe, and I'm thinking about your personal view or the view of your organization, what you believe will be the situation with local government funding in your area in 5 years' time. Are we simply going to go back to things as they were in 2019? Will it be the same amount of money? Will it be more money, less money? Will we expect the funding to go to the same kind of things, be distributed in the same way? Or will we be looking for different kinds of funding to different organizations in the cultural sector? Ralph, I'd like to ask you first. I mean, part of your job is thinking ahead strategically and internationally. So give us your view. How will things look in 5 years' time?
Yes. I don't think there's an easy answer to this question, and I think that's the reason why you've asked them. I think on the one hand, we are keen on making sure that our cultural infrastructure, as it is right now, or as it was pre-COVID, is maintained as much as possible. And therefore, we try to support them in every way we can. I can tell a little bit more about a recovery strategy we just produced last week. Similar to Rotterdam's funding plan, we also have a multi-annual funding plan called the Plan for the Arts. And that will, that will be in effect from 2021 till 2024. So in about 2 years' time, we will already start thinking about the funding plan for 2025, 2028. That means that we will still be in the recovery of COVID, crafting the strategies for a new funding plan. So COVID will undoubtedly be part of the elements of that new funding plan. Then secondly, of course, you have to wonder then, are the budgets we are now spending on culture, will we be able to maintain them for the next funding round? That all depends, of course, on the economic recovery of both the country and of the city. I think a lot of major cities in the Netherlands are hit hard by COVID. In the case of Amsterdam, we are part of the list of most hard-hit cities in the Netherlands, mainly because a lot of sectors in our city are dependent on either tourism, the visitors economy, or services that are very dependent on elements that are now prohibited because of COVID measures. So no doubtly the impact of COVID will be severe on Amsterdam, but luckily there's also a chance that we can recover quickly because of the size of our city and the size of our economy. So we are very much at the moment trying to figure out how will the economic recovery of Amsterdam relate to a cultural recovery, because they are aligned a lot. So, we also hope, of course, that tourism will start up again. Of course, in a new way. Before COVID, we were experiencing mass tourism. We've used tourism or COVID now as a way to reset our visitors economy. But of course, when you look, the 20 million people who visited Amsterdam last year, 80% of them visited culture. So it's a major revenue stream of the city, of the cultural institutes, a lot of them. It's not expected that that will be up again in the very near future. So what is our expectation then for the next 3 to 5 years? So on the one hand, now during COVID, we are looking at ways to maintain that infrastructure as much as possible, maybe put in some adaptations which will slowly be able to grow again. At the same time, we're looking 5 years ahead, and what kind of priorities are important now and will still be important. So that is in line with what you just said, David. And I'm admiring the city of Rotterdam in the ways they've put inclusion at the core of their strategy. In Amsterdam, we did it as well, but I have to say Rotterdam has taken steps even further. It will be even more important now that cultural institutions relate to the audiences in their city. There is no luxury in tourism anymore to make up for audiences not being reached in your city. So in my opinion, the agenda of inclusion and diversity will be even more important from an economic standpoint, apart from the more idealistic view on that agenda. Secondly, there's never been a better time to position culture much broader in the urban agenda of the city. I think at the moment, because of COVID, the Arts and Cultural Department is part of the policy frameworks and developments of at least 12 different departments. We all of a sudden are really included in other agendas as well. So we are now much more able to make a case for culture in other policy domains. So that is, for a much more long-term perspective, that is positive. We can build the case for culture again in the next 3 to 5 years in a much better way than we maybe did 3 to 4 years ago.
Thanks, Araf. I mean, that is encouraging, because one could imagine that in some places, culture is regarded as a nice extra. It's not really a driver of the economy. It's not really essential for the life of the city or the region. So it's encouraging to hear that in Amsterdam, culture is seen as one of the main engines for regeneration.
Yeah, and that has really been stated by the city, by the deputy mayors and the mayor, that we need culture to recover as a city.
That's very positive.
So yeah, to have that statement makes it also easy for us to gain a position within city government to put culture on the agenda.
Yeah, already a big change. And you and Rento have both mentioned diversity and inclusion, which has become a much bigger part of the agenda in the last few years. I've been living in the net, working here for a long time, but living here 6 years. And even in that time, the agenda about diversity and inclusivity has moved ahead very, very fast. So I'm pleased to hear both Rotterdam and Amsterdam are taking that seriously. I'm not sure that was the case 4 years ago. Eric, I'm going to turn to you, because one of the big differences between the United Kingdom and the Netherlands is that the proportion of public money going to the cultural sector is much higher here than in the United Kingdom. Now, on the one hand, maybe that makes the cultural sector in the UK more independent and more flexible. On the other hand, it means that in times of crisis, you may have difficulty getting hold of the extra money that must right now come from government, local and national. So again, the question is thinking about the future from 5 years to 10 years away from now. What do you expect the levels of funding to be? And do you see a shift already in the way in which that funding will be distributed to the cultural sector from local government and partners? Your microphone, Erica?
There's a joy. Sorry. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And 5 to 10 years is an interesting concept in the cultural sector in a country where political cycles are changing every 4 to 5 years, and priorities and funding are very much dependent on the government in charge at that point and their kind of approach to arts and culture. So I think, national government through COVID had, prior to COVID, a massive reduction in local government funding to arts and cultural institutions, with many of our regional local authorities cutting budgets for culture and cutting support and staff for culture. I can only see that getting worse, if I'm really honest with you, with the kind of constraints that we know from local authorities around the deficits that they are already facing in terms of their budgets. I think there are some positives on the horizon, certainly for the West Midlands, which is that we have 2 very large flagship events in the region, which are obviously internationally renowned in terms of the UK City of Culture and then the Commonwealth Games. And I think the opportunity there is to continue to highlight the value of arts and culture on a whole ecology and a whole economy in a region, and that we connect with other parts of local funding. I mean, we do still get quite a lot of funding, for example, in Birmingham Local Authority, but it was cut by about 80% about 10 years ago, which is obviously significant. It has meant that organisations are looking at and are continuing to look at new models of income generation. And I think that's where we'll start to see the sector kind of come into its own, and a changing relationship with local government in terms of much more of a partnership and a facilitation model, and hopefully kind of get some of that flexibility about how funding is distributed. I'd agree that diversity will also be a massive agenda, but for me, I think the role of the sector and of local government is to understand the wider economic impact of arts and culture and how it is worth an investment rather than giving it funding. Does that, hopefully that kind of gives a perspective. But there are lots of other things that I think local government can do, which I think is also, it's not just about money, it's about all of the other things and the other partnerships that are in play, which they can facilitate to support the organisations to be able to do what they need to do.
I definitely want to return to the question of partnerships and collaborations and the role of local government in facilitating those. And I think you have a lot of experience of that, which will be very useful for the Netherlands, where it's not quite seen as the role of the local government. Everybody does a bit of it, but I think it's further advanced in your area. You've already explained that local government funding generally in the UK is lower proportionally than it is in the Netherlands, and is likely to get worse as you've outlined it. I think you're probably right, because quite apart from COVID, we have Brexit coming up, and that's not going to be good for the economy. We can be pretty sure of that. So we'll see what happens. But on the other hand, on the plus side, I guess, because of this reduced funding, over the last 20, 30 years, British cultural organizations have got very good at finding other streams of income from all kinds of sources, including from the partnerships we'll come back to. Renzo, can you very quickly give us a bit of futurology about likely funding in Rotterdam in 5 to 10 years, and whether there's going to continue to be changes in what that money is for?
I will try, but what Araf already said, is difficult to give answers to these questions, but you can probably get a hold on the perspective we have. Well, what I recognize in what Araf just told about inclusivity and diversity is that the role of local connections is getting bigger. So local programming, the theater in Rotterdam does have very much less international touring around, so that the program is an improvisation with all kinds of local people coming in. And And that's very good because the artists are without work sometimes, and all the people who work around it. So if you can do more of that, and I will suppose that we will have the COVID regulations for a longer time. So we have to expand or minimalize our activities, and we have to be flexible in doing that. And it's difficult for organizations that produce activities on a long term. So that asks something of the field, and also of the government that finances that field. It asks for flexibility. And it probably, I just sketched you in my PowerPoint the instruments the city of Rotterdam uses. These are the subsidy instruments. But as Erica said, there are also permits. There's use of public spaces. There's use of spaces that are very large and are not useful in that capacity anymore. So we have to see if we reinvest in them in local government to make them smaller or make them flexible so they expand or minimalize at choice, depending on the arrangements they have to function in. Everybody complains about these things because it's uncertain and you can't anticipate. So you have to react very fast. And if you have a more normal order of things to do with changing public capacity, for example, then you know what model you have. And the audience also knows that. Audience connection is a problem because all the people, they come less to, because they run the risk of getting ill. And that keeps them back from coming. You see it in the musea in Holland, in the audience participation. So I think it will have to ask for the local government has to be more flexible, has to diversify its subsidy instruments. Rotterdam already does that, and we have to evaluate how that functions, if it helps in COVID circumstances. And we have to put in other things. When we had the sessions in Rotterdam, we saw that everybody is making more hybrid products. There's a combination of live and digital. So if you want to facilitate that, well, digital, not everybody can go digital because knowledge is not there. The instruments are not there. It's getting easier to do things, but on a professional level, to do it good, to have a dance presentation, which is a good digital presentation, that takes money and time and knowledge. So what the local government could facilitate is also to enhance these possibilities. So that's a bit of my view at the moment.
I mean, thanks a lot, because you've just led me to a topic I wanted to raise, and you've given us your thoughts on that. You and I have spoken about the importance of local government helping cultural organizations with transition. Now, transiting from the past to the future, yes, but the detail of what they're going to become is not yet certain, that's for sure. We can all know that digital will become more important in every facet: production, distribution, communication, engagement with audiences. That's going to be much more important. And one thing I'd like to ask Erica and Araf now is, particularly on that, we know that cultural organizations don't really have much capital. They don't have spare money lying in a bank account that they can invest in new technology, for example, or hiring people with new specialist skills. So in a world where we know digital is going to be more important, or where new costs will have to come in to develop other new business models, without necessary skills, without the money, without the technical understanding, what can local government do to help cultural organizations make these transitions? Araf, can I come to you first?
Yes. So first of all, within our funding plan for 21-24, we will create space for organizations to adapt. So, these applications have been approved by both the Amsterdam Arts Council and the City Council of Amsterdam on expectations which were set pre-COVID. We're in a different reality right now. So as a government, you need to be flexible to give organizations a chance to reevaluate their plans and ideas for the years to come. By giving space, that would mean that those institutions would be able to start thinking, okay, I might not be able to do 10 international productions anymore. I saved up money for that. I can now spend that differently. Let's put it into use for both digital productions or otherwise. So that on the one hand. Secondly, of course, not all institutions in Amsterdam have that luxury of using that annual funding to make that transition. So we are now thinking in ways in which we are able to maybe create a level playing field of knowledge and expertise on digitization. So I'm working with the innovation team of the City of Amsterdam to build something around that. Secondly, we have a separate arts foundation in Amsterdam called the Amsterdam Fund for the Arts. They, of course, have always given out grants for innovation and projects around digitization. So we're looking at ways in which we can connect with them as well to see how we can help the cultural sector. And at the same time, we want to look at ways in which we see already existing initiatives and bring them a bigger platform or bigger connections to the cultural sector. Also, because in Amsterdam there are a lot of tech companies, I'm working together with the Economic Affairs Department to also see how we can use that knowledge and experience to connect them with the cultural sector. So it's both looking inward and outward when it comes to that idea of digitization and that transition. Again, I think we have to step away from our traditional role as funder and start surfacing the cultural sector from the many sources we can offer as a city, whether that's money, whether that's knowledge, whether that's a network. We have to look at it from various ways to see how we can play a role as a government.
Thanks, Araf, and you've led me very nicely to something I particularly want to ask Erica about, which is the way in which, I mean, we're talking about transitions, we're talking about developments in the cultural sector, which are part of general developments in your cities and regions. But it was noticeable that on your presentation, Erica, your partnerships included people like public health, it included private foundations, it included business organizations, the Chamber of Commerce, for example. And for you, I guess the idea of actually helping create these partnerships is not new. Is this something that you will see developing even further in the West Midlands?
Sorry, my internet dropped out just a little bit on there.
We've been having one or two glitches, but we can understand you. So I'm just talking about the partnerships you have already helped to create across the whole region. Araf mentioned that that's a way he sees the City of Amsterdam really supporting their organizations, as well as money, expertise, some space within their existing budgets, supporting making new business plans and developing new technologies. But Araf was also talking about the way in which the City of Amsterdam has tremendous networks, for example, with technological companies. And I was pointing out that your presentation earlier showed us the wide variety of partnerships which you have in the West Midlands that you're in the middle of. Do you expect these partnerships to become even more important in the future? Erica, are you missing us?
No, I'm kind of getting you bit a bit, so I think I've got the question. Can you see me now? Is that all right?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Shall I turn my video off?
Why not?
Oh my God. Oh.
Now we can't hear you also.
Hello?
Yep, now we can, yeah, try that.
Really sorry. I don't know why it's dropping off. It's normally...
It's Brexit.
Really good.
I think Boris Johnson is turning the internet off, so you can't speak to Europeans.
Every time. I don't like it.
Carry on. Tell us about partnerships in the future.
Partnerships in the future. So yes, definitely continuing with partnerships in the future. I think it's going to get more, you're going to really stop with me now. Specifically things like the creative content sector. I was just about to raise that we're working with the local enterprise partnership. You got me at all?
Parts. I tell you what, Erica, what I suggest is that I continue talking to the other guys. And if you would start again with your internet connection, and let's see if that helps, because we're now losing half of what you're saying. Okay, so we'll carry on the conversation and come back to Erica to tell us about the partnerships they have. One thing I'll just mention though in her absence is that the seminars we've had this autumn have covered a variety of subjects, some of which have been quite philosophical about the future role of culture, Our last session was about diversity and inclusion, and we had a great presentation from Atiba Edwards, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Brooklyn Children's Museum in New York, and from Ernestine Convalius, who's the Director of the Weimar Park Theater. And specifically, we were talking about the longer term importance of inclusivity and diversity and engagement with your audiences, which is not exactly the same thing, of course, of inclusivity. It's about engaging with your communities. We've also looked at impact. So the partnership with public health, which Erica mentioned, is something which is being replicated in other parts of the United Kingdom, and I know is a growing topic of interest in the Netherlands, about the way in which culture has positive benefits outside its traditional cultural activities. Benefits in terms of the economy, everybody knows about that now, benefits in terms of the health and well-being of the individuals who participate, and impact in terms of the general social life of the city and region. And so we've looked at those topics also in the seminars this autumn. Erica, are you back with us now? Try saying something.
I think so. It feels like I can see you
much
all.
Better. That's much better. So let's start again. So the question really is, I was interested in the breadth of partnerships that you are helping to create with your organization around the whole of the West Midlands. And by the way, the West Midlands, as you said, is a whole different range of local government bodies. I mean, 5.7 million people is not too far away from the whole population of the Randstad here in the Netherlands. And it seems like you're getting local governments to all talk together in a strategic way. So in the future, I mean, I think you already told us that you do expect those partnerships, that networking with culture, working with other bodies, with other sectors, with local government as an important matchmaker. You said you would expect that to increase. You're going to give us some more thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, what we started something prior to COVID, not us, not Culture Central, but Arts Council definitely, around something called cultural compacts, which were about how you worked about cross-sector partnerships. So how you brought people like public health around the table, and the corporate sector, also business improvement districts, to look at funding and investment. It was based on a core cities inquiry. So that was already something that was being looked at in terms of how arts and cultural organisations looked at investment differently. And so they're growing. What we've done as part of the West Midlands Culture Response Unit is bring those groups also together, so they're connected across the region as well. So we have the leads of those cultural compacts from across the region who meet regularly to share their knowledge and practice. I think what we've also managed to extend that to is bringing again the business improvement districts from the different places together, again to share knowledge and to understand where there are connectivities, especially when you think about, you have rural centres, for example, and then you have very big urban conurbations like Birmingham, where you have internationally renowned organisations. How do you then connect those to rural spaces and audiences in the space, and certainly in the kind of light of COVID, for example, our village halls and our rural touring network. So, and then high streets and that use of meanwhile space. So bringing all of those different people together, not necessarily all in one room, because that's completely unmanageable, but so that people are talking to each other, sharing ideas, and that we have a coherent voice with local government, so they understand what we need, what we're trying to do, and can also advocate and see the economic and health and well-being and social benefits of the sector more widely. We've already seen the public health team in Birmingham invest in a cultural officer, which is specifically to look at cultural activity around the region, in things like physical activity and obviously health and well-being post-COVID. And those are the areas of growth and partnership. I think it's articulating that. And I think, you know, that role of local government to understand the wider context of arts and culture and how it benefits all of those places. Education, you know, that's a growing area for arts and culture. Exactly, you know, we need that. It's gone off the agenda in terms of our curriculum. So how do we make that embedded and have value for arts and culture in all of those different places? So I'm a firm believer in partnership and working together and sharing knowledge. I think has also been really, really useful. You know, you talk about digital innovation. We have big organisations who are able to build capacity and have that capacity. Then how do they share that knowledge and expertise with and provide space for those smaller, more independent capacity organisations? And then the one other place, like I say, is the local enterprise partnerships, who are basically trade, more investment in place and development, and they have lots of funds around pivoting as well. So again, how do you share that knowledge and learning around how a business might pivot to how a cultural sector organisation might pivot?
That's great, thank you. I mean, one thing you've emphasised, and again, I think this is further developed in the United Kingdom, partly because of previous funding developments from government, nationally and locally, is and something which I found frustrating here, I must be honest, in the last few years working here, is that there is still a tendency amongst cultural organisations to think of any other organisation as another kind of funding. So you make an application, you know, that a business is going to support you because you're good and because they're, you know, they should be giving you money because of what you do, and you keep trying to sell yourself to them. And the same is probably true if, you know, some cultural organizations think about funding from health bodies, they'll be thinking about applying to a health body for funding. It isn't like that, not at all. I think one thing that has changed in the UK, and I do see changing here, is an understanding amongst leaders of cultural organizations that they must be clear about what it is they can offer to their society in a very general sense, or specifically to this organization, this business, this health body. So then it becomes a genuine and mutually beneficial partnership. That seems to me quite a new way of thinking, which I expect that the current crisis will accelerate. And I'm going to stop here because I'm very keen that people who are participating, we have half an hour left, I'm very keen that people watching have a chance to put their questions as well, or to give us their views, which may be different from those that the panelists have shared with us. So you can press on the button which raises a little blue flag or a blue hand, and I can unmute you, and you can ask your question directly. We'll hear you do that. Or you can put something in the Q&A down at the bottom of your screen. So anybody from the audience, would you like to make a point or ask a question? No need to be shy. And of course, if I chair a conference in physical life, then I occasionally pick on people and just make them ask a question. It's not very fair, but on the other hand, it does get something asked. I could do that now, but I think that would be unfair. But please, if you have a point of view, if you disagreed strongly with something one of the panelists said, now's your chance. If you have a different perspective, I see that people are coming in from different kinds of organizations who may have something useful to contribute from their sector. Anybody want to ask anything, say anything? Okay, well, I'm going to keep the floor open. At any moment, if you want to ask or say anything, then put your hand up. I have to say, my experience on Zoom seminars is that people are very quiet, and I don't know the psychology of that. You would think that on the internet you can be a little more anonymous, but never mind. So I'm going to carry on the conversation, and really I'd just like to ask, let's go back to Rento. We haven't heard from you for a little while. You heard what Erica had to say about the partnerships that she and her organization have been forming so far. It's clear that you're thinking along those lines, but it does seem to me that Rotterdam, the city, the region has not yet developed the networking to the same extent that Erica has.
No, David, I think that's correct, and I'm getting a bit jealous when I hear Erica talk about what they're doing over there, because well, if you look at Rotterdam, there's a cooperation is there, but among the smaller organizations, the new entries in our Cultuurplan, it's a logical thing to do, even with the smaller organizations in the surroundings, and also with outside of their domain. But many of the organizations work together on a project basis, so they don't invest in long-term relationships working together, and it would be very wise to develop that further. But you have to have a vehicle to do that. I think the organizations Erica has in Sketches is a vehicle to facilitate cooperation, to bring people together, to talk about things, to make that happen. Our role as advisory board is a bit like that, but and the municipality has diverse roles. It gives subsidy. It has to have the political connection with the local council. It gives housing, so it has different roles. So what probably would be worth thinking about is how to facilitate this cooperation more in the eye of COVID and the necessity to do so. Some organizations are under the pressure of COVID are looking for cooperation now, and they're doing different things than they did. Sometimes corporations that come together now weren't there before COVID, and COVID speeded them up. We see a lot of things coming together, which is that, oh, that's strange, that didn't happen before, but now it has. So that's hopeful, I think. But we have to look more at the opportunities, and helping each other is not a logical thing, because I think, in my view, the cultural sector in Holland or in Rotterdam is mainly based on autonomy and on competition. Competition for money, autonomy, own cultural choices, and not on cooperation. So you have to do so to enhance interconnectivity, like we call it in Rotterdam. You have to do something more. The organizations themselves do that from their own interest. There are examples of good cooperation in Rotterdam. We have an organization in the Witte de Witstraat, it's a Kunstblok, there are about 7 organizations who do marketing together, who open up to the audience on Friday evening, entrance for free, and do activities. So they're coming together because they have a shared view on this and shared values. But that's not very often. So I hear Erica has more examples of how this can happen, and I would like to have them in Rotterdam.
David, may I reply?
Please, yeah.
But ultimately, that depends on the leadership in cultural institutions, right? And one could argue, and this is something which I discussed with David 10 years ago in London. It comes down to leadership in organizations to adapt to different circumstances, and where now there's an extreme dynamic in the circumstances in which cultural organizations operate. But at the same time, even if it wasn't for COVID, we as government, or you as Arts Council, you are pushing cultural organizations to be much more linked or partnered with stakeholders around them. And I think we have to realize in one way or another that maybe sometimes also requires new leadership or different leadership. So I think for city governments, my personal opinion is that we should acknowledge that, speak out about the need for leadership in the cultural sector, make sure that other stakeholders within the cultural domain push for that as well. And it's not necessarily to say that there should be new people in. Sometimes that is the case, but it's also about new ways of thinking about your role as a cultural institution in the area you're actually based in. And I'm always inspired. I mean, I was fortunate enough during my times in London to travel all around the UK, and 10 years ago already be inspired by the ways in which cultural institutions are connected and invested in their local environments. And to me, that was one of the key areas in which I thought, and David will probably agree with me, where cultural institutions in the Netherlands have to invest in. What is your local presence? How are you locally connected? And like Rento said, I think COVID is now giving us an opportunity to really reconnect as cultural sector with our local presence again, because we can't take anything for granted anymore. So hopefully something good will come out of COVID in that regard, that we will see some new, either existing or really new leadership in the cultural sector to really make those connections.
I like the fact we're taking an optimistic turn now in our conversation and our thinking. But I do agree with you, Araf. I mean, I do remember those conversations we had 10 years ago. I also remember the big report back session you gave in London after your trip around the United Kingdom, and the range of organizations and individuals you had together talking about your learnings. Very impressive. And I also know from conversations with you, it's been a little frustrating trying to bring those learnings back to the Netherlands. Of course, I mean, again, a personal opinion, but I hold it quite strongly, is that one of the downsides of a lot of public subsidy from local or national government is that there is far less pressure for the leadership of those organizations than to really take seriously the idea of partnerships, collaborations, engagement with local community, engagement with other kinds of organizations, for example, health organizations, to think about the economic role. So the point about leadership is a good one.
It's central for your midterm and long-term strategy. I mean,
essential.
thinking
It's
about culture
essential.
in Amsterdam in the next 5 years, you can't look away from leadership.
And bringing this back to local government again, it's one of the things that local government knows about itself, that everybody knows, which is a little uncomfortable, which is that the people who pay the money, that is the local government funders and to some extent the national government funders, they absolutely do have an influence on the organization and who leads them. And occasionally has, I think, really forced changes in leadership. Now, that's not the best way forward. Ideally, the organization decides it needs a new style of leader, maybe a new person, but maybe a new style of leadership. But leadership is something that local government, I think, can help address. Any comments on that, Erica or Rento? Erica?
I've got this. What I find interesting is I think it's not necessarily forcing, is it? But how do you get people on board passionately about a change because they've seen something? So the thing that I have tried to kind of really go is we're doing something really, really great, and you need to be on board with this because if you're not, you're missing out. But also then the strategic priorities. So the investment from our Arts Council is starting to shift in terms of priorities. So if you are publicly subsidised, you have to go along with their Let's Create strategy, which is all around partnerships, it's all around community and your benefit to either local or kind of international kind of arts communities and how you work in partnership with other organisations, along with now a very much a case around the creative case for diversity and ensuring that your organisation is extremely inclusive and has is representative of your community. So I think that's where there is an allowance for shift as well, is where those big bodies also, although don't direct how the investment goes through the local government, the criteria that they set is the agenda that we're all trying to share. And I think that's, and sharing how they're doing that encourages partnership because they have to almost to get their funding, and then they see the value in it, and then it's exciting, and then we all want to do it.
It is a noticeable difference. I mean, that was a cultural difference I noticed coming to work here. I've also lived and worked in Spain, by the way, so have a yet another example. But it's noticeable that leaders of cultural organizations in the United Kingdom are quite instinctively collaborative and cooperative. That's their starting point generally. It wasn't always like that, I have to say, because I started working in the cultural sector in the United Kingdom in the early 1990s, really just after the cuts that Thatcher made to public funding, including to culture. People were still grappling with that and what it meant. And at that moment, I think leaders of cultural organizations in Britain were also really not instinctively collaborative. They thought of themselves in competition. They would not share marketing information, for example. They would not share marketing data. They would not share marketing campaign. They were islands, rather like Rento has described at the moment. But that changed really quite quickly. And the instinctive position, I believe, of leaders in the cultural sector in the UK now is to think, yeah, let's collaborate, let's talk about it. What can we do together? I don't yet see that in the Netherlands to the same extent. I want to ask a question of, well, I think I'm talking to Rento and Araf really. The West Midlands is a very big region. It covers a lot of different, well, Erica's told us, it covers an awful lot of different kinds of places, countryside, small villages, and some very big international cities. Birmingham, in fact, is quite a lot in common with Rotterdam. Different cities, different economic background, but in some ways, similarities. Quite proud of being a second city, quite proud of being down to earth, industry, shipping in the case of Rotterdam. So quite a lot of contact, but the whole region is really quite broad. But it seems that the West Midlands, at least, has decided that a lot of these strategic issues must be shared outside the very specific local government area. And if you're doing something strategic and large scale, you can't do it at the level of a local town council. Araf, you told us you're working in Greater Amsterdam, which of course is bigger than just the city. Rento, is there a case for the initiatives you're taking, the things you see developing, covering Greater Rotterdam or all of Zuid-Holland, or what do you think will happen there?
Well, I think the city of Rotterdam, the local government is focused on Rotterdam itself, which is a large city. So we have a lot of work to do within the city limits. And there is some cooperation in the Cultuurplan, the 4-year Cultuurplan, with the region, with other cities surrounding us. But that's also the same case, that is more the case of competition than of cooperation. When I say that, there's always crossovers, there's always people coming together and sharing productions and exchanging. So if you look at different sectors, you see different arrangements. but Rotterdam is mainly focused on the city of Rotterdam itself, and that's a big thing to do. So I don't see anything not a lot of energy in other things.
We do have a question now from a real person, which is very exciting. Sorry, real person, a person who's not one of the panelists.
A real person, yes.
He's very real. I mean, somebody I happen to know. And Tariq Youssef, I'm going to ask you to give us your question. We'll see what the panelists think. Tariq, are you going to say something?
Yeah, sure. I try to do. No, tapping into the last topic about leadership, looking back at the last 10 to 15 years, we had to have some crises, financially and otherwise. This is the first one, well, not man-made, or at least I don't think it's man-made. And then the talk of leadership, especially looking at the Dutch representatives, what kind of influence do you have as a local or national government on the leadership question? And is that the biggest need in the post-COVID era? Because we can all call for leadership or yellow Ferraris, but if we don't have a stick or a carrot. So basically my question is, what kind of influence do you have as a local municipality or advisory board in Rotterdam? I'm not sure if my question also is relevant to the Midlands.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. Anybody with money can exert influence. But Araf, you wanted to answer that?
Yeah. Tariq and I know each other quite well, so I get the background of his question. So I think what is important in this regard is that we always try to look at the bigger picture. And with certain institutions as city government, we have much more influence due to historic agreements when it comes to agreeing with certain board members or being informed or being part of hiring a specific director. But at the same time, we can put it on the agenda. I think leadership should not be brought in top down. It needs to pop up bottom up. So I think it's important for us as city government to, on the one hand, address it, but secondly, look at ways in which we can facilitate that transition to new leadership. And that is, of course, something which not only a city like Amsterdam or Rotterdam could put on the agenda. There are much more stakeholders in that regard. Secondly, you could make it, I think because of COVID-19, there is some existential threat to it. If organizations are not changing somehow the ways in which they operate, either by being more connected locally or by being more connected digitally, you could face an existential threat of your organization as a leader if you don't change your behavior in the broadest sense of the word. So I think some organizations have to realize that the need for adaptation has always been around, but it's been accelerated massively because of COVID. And again, this is something we can stress as a city government as well. Guys, we are not going back to the world of 2019 again anytime soon. We all need to be aware that we need to change some of our behaviors. And I think, I think one way or another, we will see where leadership is thriving and where some leadership still needs to be developed much more. So yeah, for us, it's the need to make a level playing field in that regard.
Okay, Rinto, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I recognize what Araf just said, and I would like to add that one of the issues we brought out an advice on inclusivity and diversity some time ago. And one of the main issues was accountability, feeling responsible for making changes in your organization or in the sector. And that was a big issue because the stick and the carrot, you already mentioned this. How do you create a situation in which people take this accountability? Because we can see in Rotterdam, there's a Rotterdam cultural basis. There's 8 large organizations and the city council. The local government puts them in the position of having to take responsibility for the larger sector. There are some initiatives now in which they do that. They're talking about, like Araf said, the local government can talk to the directors and to the boards of these large organizations, and there is change visible. But they, in the last periods, we have we talk about interconnectivity, about working together, putting yourself. Making yourself responsible for the development of the cultural sector in Rotterdam, not only for your own organization, but in collaboration and in the total sum of things. So you address them differently, and that's what the local government now does. These talks are going on, but it's in this, the local government is caught in between two visions. One is it's the responsibility of the sector itself, so people have to do it themselves. They have to take on this responsibility. And the other thing is we have a subsidy instrument with which we can steer this operation. We can talk about it annually or more. We can facilitate. So in between these two, the actions lie, I think.
Okay. I'm going to ask Tarek if he had something to add to that. I mean, I should explain, we don't have the time for Tarek to introduce himself fully, but if Tarek is still there we go. Tarek, I know, because I know you, I know that you have worked, you've started and led businesses, so very successfully. You've been on the board of cultural organizations, and you were, at least for a while, the director of a very large and important theatre in Amsterdam. And you're now in charge of a department of a college in Utrecht. So Tarek, from your perspective, going back to your question, do you think there should be more use of a stick?
Correct. Oh, yeah, I'm talking. Sorry, I was typing, and no, I think the last remark of Remco is hitting the mark specifically in the Netherlands. On one hand, we have placed via subsidy structures the cultural sector on an arm's length of the government to not have government influence on the productions of the sector or the development of the sector. On the other hand, it's indeed caught between a rock and a hard place, or within these two visions that Remco remarked. I think that is really challenging for the short to midterm to see the impacts and the position the various advisory boards and governments take in these two positions they have regarding the sector. So no, thank you very much. Got a sort of sense of my question or answer to my question. It's not an easy solution nowhere. So yeah, no, thanks. Still here.
If there are more questions, you have just a few minutes to bring them up. Otherwise, I'm going to start to wind down the conversations. We've covered a really wide area. I mean, we've covered the topics that I wanted to bring out from our different perspectives. We've looked at the way in which we think the local government will, local government funding, local government involvement with culture will change in the longer term. And the answer is we're not sure. It's very difficult to see because so much is uncertain right now. But nevertheless, you know, the local governments will have to work with their organizations flexibly in the future. We've also talked specifically about the way in which local governments can support cultural organizations in developing new business models, particularly in the digital sphere. The essential role of engaging with your communities, being more collaborative, and looking inside yourselves at your own leadership, which, by the way, includes boards, Raad van Toezicht and bestuur, and not just the directors. We have to be clear about that. So we've covered all those areas and nicely found differences between the United Kingdom and what happens in Rotterdam and Amsterdam, and also differences between Rotterdam and Amsterdam. The three of you, the three panelists, are there other topics we haven't covered that you'd like to emphasize now in the last few minutes?
Well, I am curious to learn more about Rotterdam's approach now of public-private partnerships. I mean, having a presence of a foundation like Droom en Daad is very, I think, very valuable. And I've experienced myself a few months ago of how Droom en Daad is present in the city of Rotterdam. You know, you can have a debate about who owns public space for culture in Rotterdam. That's another topic. But when it comes to your view on recovering from COVID, when it comes to maintaining your cultural infrastructure, do you think there's now even more a need of a public-private partnership with regard to that approach? In Amsterdam, we think we should do more, connecting more with the private foundations. But it being a more natural fit in Rotterdam, I was wondering if you are also looking at that in a similar way.
Yes, shall I answer that, David? Because thank you. We looked at that for the last years. We one of our issues we tackled was this question of how to get a better cooperation between the public and the private, because there's a large private funding sector in Rotterdam. They're also organized, so we can easily talk to them. We also, our chair, Jacob van der Goot, talked to all kinds of people of the industries in the larger companies, because the smaller companies, they invest in culture in Rotterdam. That is very much so, but the larger don't. So the Unilevers and the other ones don't. So it's very difficult, even if you know them on the CEO level, to get them on the table to talk about how to do this. Not even asking for money, but just how to do this. It's very difficult. And so we didn't succeed up till now. And what we see is that the communication between the local government of Rotterdam and these funds, even with the Droom en Daad, is difficult. It's difficult because in the funding of the renovation of the Boijmans Museum, that's an example, it's very difficult to get in the private money and support to cooperate with to get a good cooperation. You want that but it's not good enough, and we hope it will be better in the next year, because there's a lot of money needed for only this project. So it's really a challenge, I think. We advocate a better cooperation. As an advisory board, we gave all kinds of advices, but you give advice and people have to act about that. We are not in a role of doing that ourselves. We can facilitate, we can bring people together, and we do that also with the alderman we have, with Said Kasmi. So we hope that we can put it again on the agenda for next year, for 21. But my experience is that it's difficult, and that if parties don't want to listen to each other and cooperate and seek the mutual goals, it will still be a problem for a long time. So this funding is there in Rotterdam. We are very happy about it. We're also happy about Droom en Daad, about investing in a new Landverhuizersmuseum, as you know it probably, and other things. So that's good, but the cooperation is not optimal, to say the least.
I'm going to begin to draw the seminar to a close. Erica, was there anything you wanted to tell us before we finish?
No, I don't think so. It's been really interesting just to hear it, so thank you.
Well, I mean, the three of you, of course, are now in touch with each other. And Renzo and Araf, since you haven't actually met, well, if you wanted a conversation and share notes, now's your chance. And Zoom makes it possible much more easily. There is a town in the Netherlands called Bergen op Zoom. I wonder if they're particularly busy just at the moment. Sorry, that was a bad English joke. What I'd like to draw as a final conclusion is that no matter what we think about the level of public funding in the future from local government, no matter what we think about the relationship between cultural organizations and local government has a crucial role to play one way or the other. We're all sure that role will have to be somewhat more flexible, will have to involve partnerships and collaboration, perhaps rather more than it has done in the past, certainly in the Netherlands. And we're also clear that local government will have a role to encourage the organizations they support, the organizations they work with, to be more engaged with their communities, to be more collaborative with each other, and to be more diverse and inclusive in a general sense. These trends we all seem to agree on. The details we don't know, because one thing we're sure is that it's going to be very uncertain for quite some time to come. I recommend that people talk with each other. British people tend to love talking with Dutch people and vice versa. So why not make friends with a cultural organization like yours in Britain, or with an organization like yours at local government level, and just exchange notes? Why not? And eventually, when one can travel, who knows? Could be lifelong friendships. But for the moment, share information, share ideas across the. I don't think Brexit can stop that happening. In fact, joking about Brexit, really, I'm going to stop that now because it's too painful. But seriously, those kind of relationships, those kind of learnings can happen. Well, now I'm just going to say thank you very much to the three panelists, Renzo, Erica, and Araf. It's been really interesting. Thank you for taking the time. And for those of you who've joined as audiences, we hope you found something useful to take away. And I really hope it's made you think more about your own roles, whether you're from a cultural organization or from a local government organization. That's the end of this series of seminars for FSI this autumn. We've covered a lot of territory with some wonderful speakers. The videos from those seminars and from this seminar will be available. We'll let you know when they're available on YouTube to look at. So thank you all very much, and I wish you all a wonderful Christmas and a fantastic 2021. And I look forward to seeing whatever happens with your organizations and the whole cultural sector. Something dear to my heart. Thank you very much and goodbye.